Why are the toughest men in sport seemingly so weak when it comes to their contracts and financial freedom? These are fighters who step into a cage, half naked, in front of millions of people, and fight another human being. They break bones, they get knocked unconscious, they bleed for a living. But when it comes to money, contracts, or the UFC itself, most of them stay completely silent. And the few who don't? Well, they usually learn very quickly why. In almost every other major sport, athletes eventually gain leverage. NFL players have a union, NBA stars negotiate massive contracts. Even boxers, who operate independently, can negotiate purses and shop fights around. But the UFC works differently. Because in the UFC, the promotion doesn't just organize fights, it controls the entire ecosystem. And that changes everything. The paradox. Think about it. These are men who will willingly fight someone like Francis Ngannou or Khamzat Chimaev in a cage. Yet when the topic turns to contracts, most fighters suddenly become very careful with their words. They praise the company. They thank Dana White. They call the UFC the best organization in the world, even when many of them quietly complain behind the scenes. So the question becomes, why? Why are some of the most dangerous athletes on earth seemingly powerless when negotiating their own careers? Strickland said the quiet part out loud. Every once in a while, a fighter says what most others won't. Recently, former UFC middleweight champion Strickland did exactly that in an interview with Complex.
Asking honestly, guys, has the UFC ever talked to you guys and said, hey, don't get Sean canceled, don't bring up shit that's gonna get him canceled?
Strickland openly criticized the UFC's pay structure, calling it predatory. He argued that when you compare fighter pay to other major sports, the gap is massive. In the interview, he said, if you compare it to any other sport, the UFC is the most messed up. It's not fair, it's predatory. He even claimed some fighters could make more money working at Walmart than fighting under certain contracts. Now, obviously, Strickland is known for being outspoken, but the important part is this. Almost every fighter knows this conversation exists. They just rarely say it publicly. The system fighters operate in. The UFC isn't structured like traditional sports leagues. There is no players' union, no collective bargaining agreement, no league-wide revenue sharing. Instead, fighters sign individual contracts. And that means every fighter negotiates alone. Historically, estimates from lawsuits suggested fighters received roughly 13–20% of UFC revenue, far lower than leagues like the NFL or NBA where athletes receive closer to half. So why don't fighters band together? Because the UFC has something incredibly powerful. Opportunity control. They decide who gets promoted, who gets title shots, who headlines cards, and sometimes who stays employed. The fear factor. Strickland explained something else in that same conversation. He said that if a fighter turns down a fight, the UFC will simply find someone else. In his words, you say no to a fight, they'll find some guy in some sand pit who'll do it for 5K and 5K. That's the reality of a global sport. There is always another fighter willing to take the opportunity, which creates an environment where fighters feel pressure to say yes, to fights, to contracts, to the system. Even champions show the dynamic. And this dynamic doesn't just apply to unknown fighters, even stars can show it. Recently, UFC champion Sean O'Malley reacted to the huge boxing deal involving Conor Benn. Instead of criticizing the system or questioning why opportunities like that exist outside the UFC, O'Malley mostly framed it as respect for the opportunity. And that reaction shows something important, because in the UFC ecosystem, fighters often avoid criticizing the structure that gives them their platform, even when that same structure limits their negotiating power. The Conor McGregor effect. There is, of course, one huge exception: Conor McGregor. McGregor became so big that he essentially broke the model. He crossed over into boxing, negotiated massive purses, and became bigger than the sport itself. But the key point is this: there has really only been one Conor McGregor. For most fighters, the power dynamic still heavily favors the promotion. Why fighters rarely speak up? There are three main reasons fighters rarely challenge the system publicly. 1. Career risk fighters have extremely short careers. One injury, one bad loss, one contract dispute, and your window can close quickly. So many fighters prioritize staying active over fighting the system. 2. Individual contracts. Because there's no union, fighters negotiate alone. And when everyone negotiates alone, collective leverage disappears. 3. The dream factor. For many fighters, the UFC is the ultimate goal. They've spent their entire lives trying to get there. So once they finally make it, few want to risk losing that opportunity. The irony of MMA. Which brings us back to the original paradox. These are some of the toughest men in sport. They face physical danger every time they compete, but the biggest fight in MMA isn't always inside the cage. Sometimes it's the negotiation outside of it. Strickland saying the system is predatory might sound extreme, but it reveals something interesting. Fighters know the risks of speaking out, and that's exactly why most of them don't. Because in the UFC, the fight for leverage is very different from the fight in the cage. And right now, the promotion is still winning that fight.